I've spent the better part of my career trying to understand one thing: why do great powers rise and why do they fall? Not the surface level answers, not the personalities, not the individual decisions, not the dramatic moments that fill the history books. I mean the underlying machinery, the economic forces, the debt cycles, the structural pressures that accumulate over decades until a society reaches a breaking point that, in retrospect, everyone says they should have seen coming. I've studied the Dutch Empire and the British Empire. I've studied the rise of American dominance from the ruins of World War II. I've looked at empires going back 500 years, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Ming Dynasty, trying to understand the template, the pattern, the predictable sequence of events that, once you've seen it clearly, you begin to recognize everywhere. And when I look at what is happening between the United States and Iran right now, I don't see a bilateral dispute about nuclear enrichment. I don't see a diplomatic crisis. What I see is a familiar pattern, a pattern I've been watching develop for years, playing out in real time at one of the most consequential intersections on Earth. What I'm going to share with you today is not a political opinion. I don't find political opinions particularly useful. What I'm going to share is an analytical framework, the same framework I've used to study the rise and fall of reserve currency empires for decades, applied to the forces that are driving the current confrontation. Because if you want to understand what's really happening between Washington and Tehran, you first need to understand something much larger. You need to understand the cycle. Let me take you back about 400 years, to the mid-1600s, to the Dutch Republic. At its peak, the Dutch Republic was the most economically sophisticated society on Earth. It had invented the modern joint stock company. It had created the world's first true stock exchange. Its currency, the guilder, was the global reserve currency of its era. Its navy controlled the sea lanes through which a significant portion of global trade flowed. It had built an empire of commerce that stretched from the Caribbean to the East Indies to the coast of Africa. And then, gradually, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, the weight of it became too much. The Dutch fought expensive wars to protect their trade routes and their colonial interests. They accumulated debt to fund those wars. Their domestic politics grew more fractious as different factions argued about how the costs and benefits of empire should be distributed. Their competitive advantage, the financial innovation, the trade networks, the institutional trust that had made the guilder the world's preferred currency, began to erode as other powers, particularly the British, learned from the Dutch model and improved upon it. By the early 18th century, British power was clearly in ascent. By the mid-18th century, the pound sterling had begun its long journey toward replacing the guilder as the world's reserve currency. And the Dutch Empire, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the accumulated weight of structural decline, faded from global preeminence. I've seen this pattern before, many times. The British followed almost the same trajectory. Peak power in the Victorian era, the enormous cost of maintaining a global empire, 2 world wars that drained British financial resources to the point of exhaustion, the rise of a new challenger, the United States, whose industrial base was undamaged by the wars that had devastated Europe, the pound sterling's slow surrender of reserve currency status to the dollar, the gradual contraction of British global influence from a worldwide empire to a regional power of consequence. It wasn't a failure, it was a cycle. What's important to understand is this: the cycle is not primarily about leaders or decisions or mistakes. It's about structural forces. Debt accumulates. Productivity advantages erode as others catch up. The cost of maintaining the existing order eventually exceeds the capacity to fund it. Internal political cohesion, the shared sense of purpose that powered the original rise, gives way to polarization and distributional conflict. And the international trust that was the empire's most important intangible asset begins to thin. These patterns repeat, not identically. History rhymes rather than repeating precisely, but the underlying mechanics, the debt cycle, the institutional erosion, the reputational fragility, those are consistent, and they are exactly what I see when I look at the current American position in the world. Now let me describe what we're actually observing with the United States and Iran, not as a news event, but as a data point in a much longer story. The United States constructed the current global order in the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods system. The dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed initially by gold and then by the combination of American economic dominance and American institutional credibility. The network of alliances, NATO and Europe, security partnerships across Asia and the Middle East, that extended American power and American norms across most of the globe. For roughly 50 years, this system worked extraordinarily well, not just for the United States, but for the countries that participated in it. Global trade expanded at an unprecedented rate. Poverty declined dramatically. The stability of the American-led order, imperfect as it was, enabled a level of global economic integration that lifted billions of people out of subsistence. But systems create their own contradictions. The United States, as the dominant power, made commitments that accumulated over time. Military commitments, economic commitments, the implicit commitment to enforce the rules-based order it had constructed. And funding those commitments required spending that, decade by decade, outpaced American domestic revenue, requiring ever-increasing debt. Today, American federal debt stands at a level that would have been inconceivable to the architects of Bretton Woods. The debt-to-GDP ratio, the trajectory of deficit spending, the structural gap between government obligations and government revenues. These are not political arguments, they are numerical facts. And they matter for one simple reason: debt is a constraint on future action. Every dollar of debt service is a dollar unavailable for investment in the capabilities, military, technological, diplomatic, that maintain the order. I've seen this pattern before. In the Dutch Republic, in late Victorian Britain, dominant powers that fund their dominance partly through borrowing, until the burden of past borrowing constrains the capacity for future action. So when you look at the confrontation with Iran, you are looking at an American foreign policy that is operating under a set of structural constraints that were not present 50 years ago. The question is not simply what does the United States want to do about Iran's nuclear program. The question is, what can the United States afford, financially, politically, strategically, to do, and what are the second and third order consequences of each option? That is a much harder question. And the fact that it is harder than it would have been a generation ago is itself a data point about where we are in the cycle. Now, what is the specific dynamic with Iran, and why does it matter beyond the immediate dispute? Iran has made a strategic calculation. I believe that calculation is based on a reading of the global situation that is, in some important respects, accurate, even if the values and interests driving that calculation are very different from those of the United States or its allies. Iran has concluded, and I think the evidence supports this conclusion, that the American-led order is in a period of structural stress, that the capacity of the United States to sustain enforcement of that order through economic sanctions, through military pressure, through alliance cohesion, has diminished relative to the peak of American dominance, and that the emergence of alternative power centers, particularly China, has created a degree of strategic space for countries that would previously have had no option but to accommodate American pressure. Iran has also made a bet on time. The longer its nuclear program advances, the closer it gets to the threshold that changes its strategic position permanently. A nuclear-armed Iran, or an Iran so close to nuclear capability that the distinction becomes academic, faces a very different set of external pressures than an Iran that remains clearly below that threshold. The bet is that time is on their side. This is classic behavior for a rising or resistant regional power, navigating a period of great power transition. I've seen similar logic in the behavior of rising powers in previous historical cycles. The way Japan in the early 20th century read the relative decline of British naval power and the not yet complete rise of American dominance as a window of opportunity. The way Germany in the pre-Y period calculated that the structural advantages of the existing order were eroding in ways that created space for revisionism. I'm not drawing a moral equivalence, I'm drawing a structural one. The behavior of powers that believe the existing order is shifting follows predictable patterns. They probe. They advance incrementally. They test the willingness of the dominant power to enforce its stated positions. And they make bets on the direction of change. What's important to understand is that Iran's position also reflects a reading of the internal American political situation. The polarization of American domestic politics, the difficulty of sustaining consistent long-term foreign policy commitments across administrations with radically different worldviews is not invisible to foreign governments. They track it. They model it. They calibrate their strategies around it. And this is where the internal dimension of the declining power cycle becomes most important. In my research on great power cycles, one of the most consistent findings is the relationship between domestic political cohesion and external power projection. Dominant powers at their peak tend to have a relatively high degree of internal consensus about national purpose and strategy. This doesn't mean they're harmonious or without conflict. Every society has conflicts. But there is a shared framework about what the nation is for, what its role in the world is, and what kinds of external commitments are worth sustaining. As the cycle advances, as internal wealth gaps widen, as the distribution of the gains and costs of empire becomes more contested, as the institutions that mediated those conflicts begin to lose legitimacy, that internal consensus phrase. Domestic political fights become more intense. Foreign policy becomes more volatile, more subject to reversal with each change of government. The predictability that was the dominant power's greatest intangible asset begins to erode. The United States today exhibits many of the characteristics that my research identifies with this phase of the cycle. Deep political polarization, contested institutional legitimacy, significant distributional conflict about who benefits from the existing economic arrangement, the difficulty of sustaining consistent long-term strategic commitments across administrations. None of this is unique to the United States. I've seen it in every declining dominant power. It is not a failure of character. It is a structural consequence of where you are in the cycle. But it has consequences, because when foreign governments, including Iran's government, observe the internal American political situation, they draw conclusions about the durability of American pressure, about whether sanctions that exist today will still exist in 3 years, about whether military threats that are credible today will remain credible after the next election, about whether commitments to allies that seem firm today will survive a change of administration. These calculations are not paranoid or conspiratorial. They are rational responses to observed political behavior, and they directly affect the strategic calculus of every country that is deciding how hard to push against the American-led order. History tends to rhyme in these situations. Now let's look at the global response. Because the American-Iranian confrontation does not exist in isolation, and how other countries are responding to it tells us a great deal about where we are in the broader cycle. What I observe, and what I think is most significant, is a pattern of hedging that has become nearly universal among middle and regional powers. Countries that were once reliable anchors of the American-led order are diversifying their strategic relationships. Saudi Arabia's 2023 rapprochement with Iran, mediated by China, was not simply a bilateral diplomatic development. It was a signal, highly visible, deliberately visible, that Riyadh was recalibrating its strategic positioning, that the assumption of automatic Saudi alignment with American preferences could no longer be taken for granted. This is not a betrayal of the alliance. It is a rational hedge by a country that is making long-term calculations about the durability of the existing order. India is doing something similar in its own way. India is the world's largest democracy, a natural partner for the United States in many respects, and a country that has clear reasons to be concerned about Chinese power. But India has also maintained its historic policy of strategic autonomy, buying Russian energy despite American pressure, maintaining defense ties with Russia even as it deepens its relationship with Washington. India is not choosing sides. India is choosing optionality, hedging against multiple futures simultaneously. Turkey, a NATO member, has done the same, buying Russian missile defense systems while remaining in the alliance. Hungary has pursued its own independent relationship with Moscow. Even in Europe, where the unity in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been striking, there are centrifugal forces, different national interests, different economic dependencies, different historical relationships that are creating gradations within the alliance. What I see is a world that is already, practically speaking, in the early stages of multipolarity, not a formal declared multipolarity, not a dramatic announcement that the American era is over, but a practical behavioral multipolarity, countries maintaining ties to multiple great powers, avoiding dependencies on any single patron, building optionality. This is exactly what happens in the transition period between world orders. The decline of the dominant power, the slow erosion of the certainty that the existing order will be enforced, creates rational incentives for every other country to hedge, and the accumulation of those individual hedges further accelerates the transition, because each hedge that goes unpunished signals to every other potential hedger that the cost of diversification is lower than previously assumed. This is how world orders end, not with a single dramatic moment of rupture, but with 1,000 small decisions, each individually rational, whose cumulative effect is transformative. Let me turn to markets, because markets are, in some ways, the most honest signals we have about how sophisticated actors are thinking about the future. Markets aggregate information from thousands of participants making real decisions with real capital, which makes them a useful, if imperfect, indicator of what informed actors believe about where things are going. What are markets telling us about the current geopolitical moment? Oil prices carry a consistent risk premium for Middle East instability that has been elevated for some time. This is rational. A conflict that significantly disrupted Persian Gulf shipping lanes would affect roughly 20% of global oil supply, a disruption whose economic consequences would be felt in every country on Earth. But the more interesting signal, in my view, is in currency and gold markets. The dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, but the dollar's share of global central bank reserves has been declining gradually, not catastrophically, but consistently, for the better part of 2 decades. Central banks around the world have been increasing their gold allocations, not dramatically, but persistently. Gold, which pays no yield and has no claim on any government's revenues, only makes sense as a reserve asset if you are concerned about the future reliability of the alternative. The central banks buying gold are expressing, in the most practical and concrete way possible, a concern about the durability of the dollar-denominated system. I've been monitoring these flows for years. They are consistent with what I would expect to see in the period before a meaningful reserve currency transition. Not the transition itself, that could be decades away, if it happens at all, and I'm not making that prediction.
But the early-stage portfolio diversification that sophisticated actors undertake when they begin to assign non-trivial probability to a significant structural change. What this means for the Iranian situation is important. The more that Iran's resistance to American pressure is seen as sustainable, the more that other countries conclude that defiance of American sanctions is possible without catastrophic economic consequences, the more the dollar's coercive power as a foreign policy tool is called into question.
And the more it is questioned, the more countries quietly begin to build alternatives to dollar dependency. This is a feedback loop, and once it begins, it is very difficult to stop. Let me step back now and connect all of this to the biggest picture, the question of where we actually are in the historical cycle. What I see when I look at the totality of the evidence, the debt levels, the political polarization, the hedging behavior of middle powers, the market signals, the specific dynamics of the American-Iranian confrontation, is a world in transition. Not a world that has already transitioned. Not a world where American power is broken or the existing order has collapsed. The United States remains, by almost any metric, the most powerful nation on Earth. Its military is without peer. Its economy, despite its structural challenges, remains the world's largest. Its institutions, however stressed, retain significant capacity and legitimacy. But power is not just a snapshot, it's a trajectory. And the trajectory of relative American power relative to its own peak, relative to the rise of China, relative to the growing strategic independence of the rest of the world, is one of gradual decline, not collapse, decline. There is an enormous difference. The historical record suggests that these transitions from one dominant power to the next, or from unipolarity to genuine multipolarity, typically unfold over decades. They are rarely linear. There are moments of apparent stabilization, moments of apparent acceleration. The outcome is not predetermined. Choices made during the transition period matter enormously. In every historical transition I've studied, there were moments where different decisions might have produced different outcomes. The British transition to American leadership after World War II was, by historical standards, remarkably managed, partly because the two countries shared a language, a legal tradition, and a broad strategic orientation. The transitions before that one were often far more violent and destructive. The question for our current moment is not whether a transition is happening. I believe the evidence is strong that it is. The question is what kind of transition it will be, whether the declining dominant power and the rising challenger can find stable frameworks for coexistence and manage competition, or whether the structural pressures generate conflicts, military, economic, or both, that make the transition far more destructive than it needs to be? That question remains genuinely open.
Let me end with a reflection on what all of this means for the decisions that matter most, the decisions that individuals, institutions, and governments will make in the years ahead. The American-Iranian confrontation is important in itself. How it resolves, whether through negotiated agreement, through an escalation that is then contained, through Iranian nuclear threshold status, or through some combination of factors that produces an outcome none of the current players intend, will have significant consequences for regional
stability, for energy markets, for the broader question of whether nuclear proliferation can be contained. But I would suggest thinking about it not primarily as a bilateral crisis, but as one data point in a much larger process of global structural change. The great power transitions of history were not decided by any single event. They were decided by the accumulation of structural advantages and disadvantages over time, by who built the most productive economic system, who maintained the most cohesive institutions, who sustained the most reliable commitments over the longest time horizon. Those are still the questions that matter most. Can the United States address its structural fiscal challenges in a way that preserves its capacity to sustain the commitments that are the foundation of its alliance system? Can it rebuild the domestic political cohesion that translates into consistent, credible foreign policy over time? Can it find a relationship with China, the most consequential bilateral relationship of the coming decades, that manages competition without escalating into conflict? Can Iran, for its part, find a path toward the regional security it seeks, without acquiring capabilities that make conflict with Israel, and therefore with the United States, structurally unavoidable? Can the region as a whole begin to build the frameworks for stability that would allow the enormous human and economic capital of the Middle East to be invested in development rather than conflict? Can the international institutions that were built to manage precisely these kinds of great power tensions be reformed and adapted to a more multipolar world, rather than either captured by the interests of declining or rising powers or simply bypassed into irrelevance? These are the questions I think about. They don't have easy answers. They may not have good answers. History doesn't always offer good answers. But asking them clearly and honestly, rather than through the distorting lens of partisan politics or short-term crisis management, is the necessary first step. I've spent decades studying history, and the one thing it teaches above all others is that the decisions that shape the future are almost always made in the present, by people who don't fully understand the moment they're in, by people who are looking at a transition and seeing only the immediate crisis, not the structural change beneath it. We have the advantage right now of being able to see the pattern, to recognize with reasonable clarity where we are in the historical cycle. The question is whether that understanding translates into better decisions. History, unfortunately, does not guarantee that it will, but it at least gives us the chance.